everything that was happening at the time. This was back in when we started out. It was like 2012. There was towards the end of the reign of organizations like Hypercube. Remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of those went out in a blaze of glory, and they were supposed to be prim and proper. Yeah. Great question. So K Media Africa is a multimedia production studio and also a consultancy at the same time. It started out in 2016. That was before my organization, which was Sigma Digital, was then acquired by what we have as K Media Africa today.
Yeah.
So that makes me a director at the company together with my co-director, the MD, Keith Guzai, you might know him.
Yeah.
And generally, we're like a collision of two sides of the media industry, which is the visual side and the audio side,
Yeah.
right? But we also bring forward a lot of expertise in terms of just what we know about advertising, film production, radio production, and then of course the multimedia stuff, the cool stuff, the animation and VR and AR and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So a typical day would involve us looking at whatever projects we're handling at the time. Like I said, there's a consultancy aspect to it where we consult for a number of organizations. Some are corporate, some are in the civic arena. And generally we problem solve for them because of the pace at which media is transforming, the digital influence of this all. People are talking about so many new developments, the legality of AI, for example, the impact of NFT in art, and then of course the grassroots stuff, how to incubate and help artists become more sustainable, how to build capacity. And some of the stuff that we excel at are lessons that we learned when we started Comexposed, for example, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
So a typical day can range from recording.
It varies.
Yeah, it varies. It can go from recording material in the studio for, it could be a radio show, it could be a radio ad, it could be voiceovers for an animated show. Which I enjoy a lot, and that's one of the many services that we have. Or it could be animating. It could be animating a bank commercial, like an animated commercial. There's been a big upsurge on these chatbots, and everyone wants an animated character, an avatar to go along with it. So they could involve that, or we could be working on a bigger project. For example, last year we worked on Ephemeral Tales, the Tale of Stavro. That was many months of writing, pre-production, finally production, recruiting, training within all of that. And generally we invest as well. We invest in creatives that we encounter in the fledgling animation industry that we have here in Zimbabwe. And we also invest, of course, in Comexposed, which is the organization which pretty much brought Tino and I to the forefront in the mid-2010s, So that's a rough kind of example of
what your life looks like right now.
Yeah,
fair enough. That sounds like really interesting, right?
I love my job.
Because you're working with all these like cool technologies, right?
Yeah.
Like animation, which is I don't know if I would still use the word novelty in Zim, but I think to a degree it kind of is, right?
It still is.
It still is, right?
It still is.
It's a novelty. Like every time I see an animated ad, I'm just like, wow, this is so amazing.
You'll be surprised how many people don't know what goes into it. I've got this fun story. We were working on an animated commercial, right? And in this commercial, there was a character. And in the 3D space, you can have reflections, like a character can reflect the environment and so on. So we had textured and put shaders on this character that were reflecting his environment, and it looked like you could see the windows or the room in general. And when during a feedback session with our client, one of the comments was, where you were recording the animation, there seem to be windows and things. Can you? So some people have this idea that it's something like film, but they don't understand that everything is actually happening in a virtual environment inside of a computer.
When you're recording.
Yeah, so you're right when you say it's still a bit of a novelty. There's still a lot of mystery around what the technology and what the art form brings.
There's a lot of educating to do.
Oh yeah.
And I suppose that goes both ways in terms of educating people of the use cases, but educating as well younger people, especially of the opportunity, right, to be able to actually have a career that's sustainable within this industry.
Yeah.
In your view, how far are we from that in the context of Zim, where we have illustrators? What are the other roles, man? I'm trying animators.
Illustrators, animators, but yeah. I've got some shocking news.
Yeah.
We're not far. The skills are there. But that's good news, but it comes with bad news.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised at how many competent animators and artists within the field are working in LA. Zimbabweans are working in the UK for companies like Double Negative, or Jonathan Simmons, for example, who was working on Game of Thrones, or there's a whole bunch of guys working at Netflix now.
I remember Will. I think Will did.
Will Jarabas, who was my student once upon a time.
On production for Marvel, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he worked on Thor. He worked on he worked on at least 2 Marvel movies.
Yeah.
So the truth is, the skills are there. The professionals are coming out of Zim every other year. The problem is the opportunities just don't exist within Zimbabwe. So where are we in terms of creating like feature length film? The earliest Zimbabwean feature length animated film was, I think it was called Legend of the Sky Kingdom. That came out in the late 2000s. Ooh. Yeah, it was a stop motion film and it was great. But since then, investment has shrunk. Everyone wants to shoot. Everyone wants to play it safe.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to play it safe. Why hire a team of animators where you can hire, traditional actors, put together a crew, and
people
risk
don't get it yet.
Yeah, people are still very risk averse. And I guess that's where organizations like K-Media come in to give that kind of support to say it's not as complicated, or we can fill in the gaps, the knowledge gaps that exist in what you want to achieve. So there are a lot of things that need to be dispelled, of course. Like animation is this thing where you press a button and then cool stuff shoots out.
Yeah. or I think another conception, or at least misconception that people have is it's a medium for storytelling that's aimed at just children, right? No harm in that, but it's much bigger and broader than that, right?
Yeah.
It's way broader than that.
I mean, today in so many films, they're what are called invisible effects, right? For example, you can have a very realistic series, like I remember watching a series called The Mosquito Coast, and there was a sequence where these 2 kids are watching a swarm of butterflies just kind of gather around a tree. And if you're untrained, you'd think, oh great, they waited for the perfect moment for butterflies to just train these amazing acrobatic butterflies. But that was, of course, done digitally. And just getting people to understand the application of visual effects and animation, and how it's paired with film, that's a process on its own. We'll talk about that a bit later when you talk about Comexposed and the awareness campaign we had to do back in 2015. And that was about comic books, so you can imagine what you go through visual effects and animation.
Man, fair enough. I do love that because we cannot domesticate butterflies, clearly. I think that's a critical point.
Oh yeah. If you can find butterflies, because global warming and climate change, it's doing its thing as well. We're living in a world where bees are slowly becoming extinct.
It's crazy, man. It's a weird time. It's a weird time. But one of the key mandates of K-Media Africa, and I think just from the brief explanations you've given, it kind of reflects, right? One of the key mandates you have is to tell African stories. Why is it so important to you and the organization that we start telling African stories?
Yeah, I think I'll share my personal views on African stories.
Yeah.
I think by now it's become a bit of a chorus, like we need to be represented, our stories told our way and so on. But I think there are broader dynamics at play. For example, if we tell our own stories, we get to shape our own psyche as people, right? The reason why we can watch American media or European media and feel like they're such a cool group of people.
So
we should go there. We want to go to the Eiffel Tower. We want to, study at Harvard or, do the things they do is because they've shaped their own perception, right? And I think with us, we need to tell our own stories for the reason of a self-actualization, right? We need to be able to, and what that means is we need to be aware of who we are and that what we are is sufficient, that we qualify as human beings.
Yeah.
Because if you look at all the African tropes, most of the times in movies in the last 20 years, if you see an African character, it's a warlord, it's a refugee, terrorist, poverty-stricken, flies on their eyeballs, that kind of thing. But then coming back to my point, there's a bit of self-determination. It's a good thing to say, I want to be, I'm seeing someone who's an African, say, professor who specializes in African studies, and that is a cool thing, as opposed to a guy who's studying vibranium and his name is Bruce Banner and whatnot. So there's a certain level of pride that we believe we can reintroduce into the African space. The narratives that already exist, that goes without saying, yes, we need the folk tales reinvented. We need a lot of things, but through my work, for example, I'm always trying to push the boundaries of what is the African equivalent of the Lord of the Rings? What is the Zimbabwean equivalent of Shadow and Bone? So one of the things that I get often as an animator is, you should make a Tsuru and Kudo, and I'm like, no, that story's been told, it. You can imagine them, that's fine. But there's a whole broad and unexplored spectrum of African fantasy
that just hasn't been touched.
That hasn't been touched. And there's a lot that we need to fight against, through our own African storytelling, like the dilution of our own beliefs by religion, for example. If you see magic in an African setting, all of a sudden, that is some ancestral weird stuff. But
when you watch Harry Potter,
there you go.
Fantastic.
You accept that. So there's a whole process that needs to take place in terms of normalizing our own culture and our own take on what is magic, what is fantasy, what is an elf, what is a gnome, what is a troll. And no matter how badly that might be associated with some so-called black magic or the dark continent or whatever, it's strange how when we see Guillermo del Toro's monsters, we're like, that's pure genius. Like, that is the same kind of stuff we have here. But we limit ourselves from telling those stories. And it's not all about the grotesque or the macabre type of things. I mean, there's so much in terms of science and technology that comes from this continent, which eclipses, the so-called genius of a Peter Parker or a Tony Stark. Recently we've had that discovery of the electrified rocks in DRC. Everybody's talking about that.
I saw that.
I can't wait for that to be verified. I don't know if it's legit, but think of what kind of stories we can tell, because that stuff is it's local, it's native, it's ours to own and to interpret in our own way without any of the typical white savior kind of things coming in and encroaching on the story. So I look at African storytelling as a necessity, right? Because more and more kids that I talk to, like kids in like preschool, grade 1, grade 2, they're like, Eugene, I've got this character, and his name is Brian Warlock, or why isn't his name Tendai? What's wrong with that? He's from the UK, and so I'm like, why isn't he from Harare? Where are you from? I'm from Harare. Why is your character from the UK?
I haven't been to the UK.
You see, exactly. And the sad truth is, subconsciously they look at their own identity as uncool, if not just terrible. And for a kid aged anywhere between 6 and 9 to be thinking that way, that's a loss on our part. It's failure actually on our part. So that's the one thing that I feel like African narratives need to remedy, because if we can capture young people and change their perspective on who they are, first, then we can tell stories about anything proudly. Right now, we're too shy. For example, I've got this character called Nevenuro, right?
Yeah.
And there was a big discussion on a group once upon a time, many years ago. And I wasn't a part of this discussion, but someone said, we're never going to make cool comic books in Zimbabwe if the best we can do is characters named Nevenuro, right? And the question that rose from that was, okay, what did you want the character to be called?
Yeah.
And what language do you speak? You see? So when you start to interrogate those approaches to looking at our own material, you realize that it comes from this tainted identity, this failure to self-actualize, this failure
we need to civilize Africa.
Yeah, or we need to stay civilized.
Exactly.
We need to stay, whatever that means. So the flip side is there was a different forum that I looked at where someone was an African-American guy was commenting on characters with names like Gambanyika and Nevenuro. It's like, this is beautiful. I get to learn how to say a complicated African word. In the same way that you have people here who are, they seem sophisticated when they say a French word like je ne sais quoi, or whatever it could be. You feel more learned or cultured. Yeah, but remember, when you go to that culture, they feel like they're cultured when they can talk about our culture. But we've got this, self-hate thing going on. So one of my main missions early on is to normalize that, to normalize the characters with long names like Nevenuro, Umzingeli, or Gambanyika, and have people say, what does that mean? Tell me that story. Where are you going with this? Instead of, having someone named John Scar. Never met one. So that's one of our many takes on it. And of course, there's the obvious. We do need to tell our own stories. That goes without saying. We do need to tell our own stories authentically. We need to own our own narratives. A number of the usual chorus answers, I believe, need to be repeated. They're still valid. Exactly. Yeah,
I hear that, man. And I love everything you say, because I could literally take that on and put it on. I could transcribe that and put it as part of our mission, right? Where we just want to put a spotlight on people who are doing exactly what you said, self-actualizing. Like putting a spotlight on African stories, on people who are doing fantastic things in Zimbabwe, in the context that we're in. A tough place, but people are fighting.
I think there are a lot of amazing stories that come out of it. The story of comic book artists, for example, within the Comexposed community, that's a narrative all on its own. Right? What I mean by that is no one thought it was possible. No one thought it would be no one thought it was possible. No one thought there would ever be a gun dog, and that's a comic book that sold crazy, thousands of copies back in 2009, and I mean, it was licensed to apparel brands at the time, like your Faithwear and what have you. They were advertising, and the business opportunity was realized. Was big, the concept, the proof of concept was made real, and that in itself is a narrative to say, okay, just because you're great at art, it doesn't mean you should become a graphic designer and design logos. He changed the narrative. Later on, when, for example, when I did Hotshots, the comic book in 2012, that was the first time someone actually had a full-time comic book artist job. And again, it changed the narrative. And then we pushed it further when, Tino and I got together and we started Comexposed. And the rest of the stories that came out of that, the comic up, which we published back then, which was self-published, that again was a narrative on its own. And I think the story of it being an independently produced Zimbabwean comic book attracted people to the stories inside. Like, if these guys were so tenacious to put this together, what's in it? What are these stories? Because we're seeing a lot of, back then, unfamiliar faces. And it's 10 years of that now.
Essentially.
It's 10 years, and that's crazy.
So maybe let's actually touch on that first comic from 2012, Hotshots, right? I hadn't scripted it, but that's definitely interesting in that, like you said, you were working on that full time. How did you make that possible? Because I'm sure there are a number of kids who are going to watch this, or even like adults, right? Who have a similar skill set, but they can't find the balance to actually make it viable?
Wow, that's such a cool question. So I've never talked about Hotshots on camera before, but so yeah, this is interesting. So let me contextualize it.
Yeah.
That was in 2012, right? That's 10 years ago now.
Yeah.
But what happened was the environment back then was very different. No one was posting digital art on social media.
People were barely starting to get online in Zimbabwe.
Exactly. Yeah.
So because I remember, I think mobile internet came in 2009.
Yeah.
In Zim.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah, you can go on.
So back in 2009, funny you should say, I had started my journey exploring African characters, right? And I had posted 2 characters online back in 2009. One was Nepenuro Man, right? Who'd later just become Nepenuro. And then the second was Umzingeli.
Yeah.
Now, I was one of the few guys drawing with a stylus tablet back then, and I was trying my best to post. And that was before this whole wave of artists posting and hashtags and all of that stuff. And in Zim, it was a very big novelty. So coming back to Hotshots, it turns out that a local magazine wanted to create a comic book insert, like a full 12-page comic book insert in full color, but they didn't know about comic book artists.
Exactly.
So there they were, not minding their own business on social media, and they came across the post of Umzingeli, which was full color. And they were like, the person who did this, we need to get in touch with him and he needs to do Hotshots. So they got in touch with me based on that, and we came to an agreement on how I would be the artist working on Hotshots, which ran for 6 whole issues, which is probably the longest serialized run of a comic book in Zimbabwe. And it was a lot of hard work. The reason being they had such a hard time finding one artist, but for those who don't know, it takes 4 artists to make a comic book.
So you were, break down those roles for me.
So the roles within a comic book production are, you've got a penciler, the person who does the initial drawings, the pencils, the drafting, pretty much layout and that kind of thing. Then you've got an inker. An inker is the person who pretty much makes the solid outlines and some of the shading, defines all the artwork. So inking is very complicated because traditionally you do it with a crow quill pen, very special pen, a paintbrush, whiteout. It's a lot more complicated than inking. It's an art form on its own, right? And then you'd move on to coloring, right, which is pretty much self-explanatory. Then lettering, which is, think of it as how you have someone doing typesetting for a magazine today, but specializing in comic books. So you're the guy making sure all the words are the right font so they're legible no matter how small the speech bubble is or the caption is and that kind of thing. So all of that fell on one person for 6 months.
That sounds intense.
Yeah, if you want to age very quickly, you do that. Take it from here. But it was a big success. I think it's a narrative which helped other people realize that it was possible. There's a guy I know personally. He's a storyboard artist at Netflix now. He's a Zimbabwean guy. And when we met, he said he was inspired by Hotshots because he was in high school when it came out, and I was like, oh my gosh, who would have known,
Exactly.
So the impact of just that journey for people like Tino, for people like myself, and what it helped to do for other artists who came out, because at some point Tino and I were lecturers. We were lecturers at an animation school where we met a lot of the now senior members of Comexposed, and that's an incredible journey all on its own, because
to be able to see that,
to be able to see that growth and to see how far these guys have gone. Like you mentioned, Will, who's worked on Marvel movies and things like that. That's mind blowing, man.
Yo, long may you reign, man. Hotshots. That sounds like an interesting story. Let's touch on Comexposed, right?
Yeah.
Because Comexposed was, for lack of a better term, your claim to fame.
It was our magnum opus at the time. Yeah,
right. And so this is, I don't know if the origin story starts in 2015, but the actualization of the event is 2015.
Yeah.
So how does that come about? What is the thinking behind that? When does that story start?
Oh, that story starts in 2011.
Ooh.
Yeah, that story starts in 2011. So, again, there wasn't much of a big comic book. There wasn't a comic book community at all, actually. It didn't exist.
Yeah.
Back in 2011, you had guys like Norm Lilo, Solomon Maramba, Shingi Mtezo, Carl Joshua Nube, and the late Claire Dongo, who started JAG, the Joint African Animators Group, right? And that was them pushing for animators, because at that point, in the late 2000s, they were the main dudes in animation.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, these are some of the artists behind like the Ever Sharp 15M commercial of the 2000s, the Zimbabwe cricket animations that used to appear back in the day when we played a lot of test matches. These are like the old guard, right?
Pioneers.
The pioneers, the godfathers of animation in Zim. So back in 2011, they were working on a festival called Zimfire, which was under the Joint African Animators Group. And this was the first real effort to create an event in the community where people would physically meet, aspiring animators, digital artists, and the like. And this was the first time I got to meet the entire community. I was known as this, I was only known online. People just knew, this is Ramirez guy. This is Ramirez. Who is he anyway? Simply because at the time I had done a bunch of renders that I'd put online, but no one had met me. And I was, a kid in comparison to today. So what happened was, during this event, I got to meet Tino.
Yeah.
And I remember it was the late Claire who was like, hey, Eugene, you're a comic book guy. That's the Gundog guy. I was like, oh, that's the Gundog guy? And then we met. Little did we know that within a year we'd be lecturing at the same animation school, Tino and I. That's where our, our views and our shared views and our interests came together. And also just identifying that we had some interesting skills, and we had a passion for illustration as much as we had a passion for animation. So meanwhile, that happened in true comic book fashion. Meanwhile, things at JAG were not really amalgamating as quickly as they would have wanted, and that event kind of fell away, Zimfire. It later became Zimbabwe Animated, and it fell away. That's why no one really talks about it that much. So we, being beneficiaries of that organization, or members of that organization, and also being teachers, we had students, people who looked up to us, and they're like, guys, what's next? So in late 2011, early 2012, that's where the whole Comexposed idea was hatched, because we're like, look, animation is going to be difficult to produce in Zimbabwe, right? But we've already proven it. We can make comic books. We are comic book dudes. And by 2012, long after Hotshots was out of print, and long after Gundog was done, we decided, what if we made an organization but we played to our strengths? And our strengths and our experiences around comic books. Let's make a comic book convention in Zimbabwe. So between 2012 and 2014, we were working on building the community online. And we're working on an awareness campaign. And that awareness campaign was, what are comic books? How can comic books be used as a storytelling medium in Zimbabwe? What kind of stories can we tell? And that's where we started pushing a lot of our old IP. I resuscitated Umzingeli, redesigned it. Tino brought back Gundog and rebranded him as Gambanika. And then we started working towards Comic Up Volume 1, which was an anthology comic book where we got upcoming artists and some experienced artists like Kudzai Gumbo and Dananai Mwanigwa now, and so many others, to come up with short stories and put them all in one comic book. And that was Comic Up Volume 1, which debuted at the first convention. That was in 2015. So not many people know this, but a lot of hard work went on at Comexposed between 2012 and 2015 when we started having
that community.
Just to build the community and get people to understand what we're trying to do. And also to separate ourselves a bit. We weren't trying to be the bannerman for animation. We wanted to start with the small wins. We were like, you know what, this comic book stuff, we get it, we understand
that's what we're about.
Yeah, and we also had a really good network that we established because Comexposed, the group, was one of the first African art communities.
Yeah.
So it wasn't long before Zambian artists jumped on South African artists like Clyde Beach, Lois Mkize, the guys from Nigeria like Jide Martin, Ayodele Elegba. These are like big names now. These guys are running studios, and sending their IP to HBO and the like, and these guys were part of Comexposed. Royo Coupe, his show based on one of his comic books is going to be on HBO, Yeah, and these guys were all on Comexposed. Fun fact, if you dig through the Comexposed YouTube archive, you'll find interviews with these guys. Yeah, before.
Now,
like,
larger than life.
Exactly. So that whole journey, it was laborious because we self-funded a lot of that activity. We self-funded a lot of the admin. A lot of praise goes to the community because a lot of volunteers came up and they said, we'll work for free. We're down with this vision. And one thing that we promised ourselves was we didn't want to fall away. We didn't want whatever happened to prior organizations or groups that focused on digital art and animation. We didn't want that to happen to us. So we identified what needed to happen for us to stay, the whole journey. Yeah. And
what do you think are some of those things?
Administration. It's the boring stuff that no one wants to do.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's the boring stuff that no one wants to do, but it's actually the glue that holds everything together. Comic books, animation, video game development, all of that stuff, it's very appealing. It's very fun.
Quite fun.
And you're going to attract a lot of people who are creative, a lot of people who are thinkers, deep thinkers, but they're not necessarily the best when it comes to being organized.
Yeah.
And if
doing the boring stuff.
Yeah, the boring stuff. And it's about doing the boring stuff consistently. And like within the Comexposed community, we say Tino is the heart and soul of Comexposed. Yeah. And then Eugene is the overlord. But it's a bit of a joke because I'm the guy I'm all about structure, I'm all about, rules. Yeah, and discipline. Because believe it or not, for Walt Disney to be what it is today, or for Marvel Comics to be what it is, or DC Comics, a lot of discipline went into that. You can't be like, I'm going to draw today, and I'm going to try and make a comic book, and then a few days down the line, I'm like, no, you know what, maybe not, I don't care about it.
Or let me switch to a different idea.
Exactly. Yeah. Or, not do basic things like accounting, keep your books, keep a register of names. If this is a real community, let's know who's in it. Let's have a code of conduct. A lot of those things didn't exist for past organizations, and as a result, you couldn't hold anyone accountable. You couldn't plan ahead because you didn't know who was going to be there and who was going to leave. We wanted that to be a hallmark to say, yes, the fun stuff has to be in the forefront, yes, but then the foundation of all of this has to be some solid structure, some organizational hierarchy, some of the things that no one wants to talk about but needs to happen so that because people take it for granted. If you put out a poster and you say we're an organization, and there's a phone number there, when people call that number, someone has to answer.
Exactly.
We take it for granted, but that's a big deal. Because the reason why we don't have a lot of investor confidence, and I'm not just talking about from corporates or whatever, even NGOs, for example, they don't have that confidence that if they write you an email, someone is going to respond appropriately and professionally. Exactly. Yeah. And that's one of the things that we decided on, and that's one of the things that we ensured and made sure would stick to if the organization was going to run the full course.
And so far so good.
It's only been 10 years.
We're aging mightily close to the decade mark.
Oh yeah, a few months away.
Yeah. Damn, time flies.
Yeah. It sure does. Yeah.
And so, when I think you touched on it a bit, right? But the event itself, what are the challenges you face when you're putting together something like that?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is Zimbabwe. So every year has been a different set of challenges. The first one was, of course, the hardest.
Yeah.
It was self-funded, so the biggest challenge was Tino and I taking funds from our own
pockets.
Yeah, and our own businesses at the time, because he was a professional, artist. I was a professional artist, so it meant taking our own profits from our own enterprises or businesses and plowing them into Comexposed. That's a sacrifice that I think everyone would understand what goes into that, and the buy-in from the general public.
Yeah.
Please note, it's called Comexposed. It was never called Comic-Con Harare.
Yeah.
Right? And that in itself was deliberate, because we knew Zimbabweans are familiar with fairs, they're familiar with expos, they're, like agricultural fair or show, that. So we needed to align the branding and the communication with something more familiar, because the obvious question when you say to someone, come to Comexposed, they'll be like, what on earth is that? So we had to invest in making sure that was comprehensive. So a lot of print costs, a lot of work just sponsoring ads on social media back then was a lot more expensive, I think. A number of things that we had to do, and of course partnerships with corporates. If you think approaching the general public with an idea like Comexposed is hard, what about approaching a potential investor who you're telling you're doing this for the first time? So those were obvious challenges. Everything that was happening at the time, this was back in when we started out, it was like 2012. There was towards the end of the reign of organizations like Hypercube. Remember that? Yeah, and a lot of those went out in a blaze of glory, and they were supposed to be prim and proper. Yeah, you can put that in the trailer. And there was a lot. There were extremely high expectations of them, and by prim and proper, I mean it was very sanitized. It was corporate. It had that startup
they could
lingo.
Get into any room and navigate with the grace necessary.
It made sense. If you're talking about raising money for startups or housing startups, young black businesses, and so it made perfect sense. And then here come these guys, and they're like, "Yeah, we want to make Zimbabwe comic books, and we want to make an event, and we want people to gather around and see how cool Zimbabwean comic book characters."
And it's like, who are you?
Who are you, and are you out of your mind? And that happened often. It happened often that people were like, "You are out of your mind." So it came as a complete shock, but it was really awesome that till this day, our first event actually, we did end up breaking through to a lot of open-minded visionaries in the corporate sector that partnered with us, very, very big names in the corporate industry, and they sponsored us, and it really gave us that credibility. After our first one, within a matter of weeks, people were asking, when is the next Comexposed? Because it finally made sense. Like, there is space for corporates to advertise. There's space for creatives to sell their stuff. This is a legitimate marketplace. There's a round table where subject matter that's not discussed anywhere else is looked at, and you've got professionals who are going to come talk about things you can't find in a textbook, and at the time you couldn't find on the internet, because no one was talking about how to get started as an animator or a comic book artist in Africa. It wasn't as rampant as it is now. So that was the hardest part. It still exists, and earlier I said every year is different because we know the social and economic challenges that we go through in Zim, and every year has presented a whole bunch. I mean, sometimes, whether it was like shortage of foreign currency at one point, 1:1, it's no longer what all sorts of ups and downs. So every year for the past 9 years, I think we've had a new something to combat, and it's evolving. So we also need to keep evolving. I mean, when we started, it was just Comexposed, but now people talk of Converge. And all of those decisions to rebrand, not rebrand per se, but to just keep changing, keep adapting and bringing new things. It's helped. It's helped a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting, man. And so an interesting thing, and you touched on it briefly with your allusion to the social context, the social and economic context of Zim, right? Is that people are working in an underfunded industry. in an industry where the market is not like clearly defined. Like if I make a comic, who do I sell it to? Where do I find them? What's the best avenue for distribution? All of these things are dicey, right? The question that then comes to me is, you've worked with different kinds of sponsors and people who fund these projects, right? One of the things I hear a lot from people, and I have witnessed this, maybe not like in personal experience, but just as a media practitioner, is that sometimes with funds comes agendas, right? And sometimes agendas overriding those of the creators. Is that something you have experienced or seen play out in the context of Zim?
Yeah. I mean, it happens. It happens quite often. Some of the advice that I got from some of the guys that I looked up to that had similar events and really amazing Zimbabwean startups that were started by some legends, and I'm talking about the tech Zims of this world and whatnot. Some of the advice that I got from that generation was to look out for that agendaism, like the money that comes with terms and conditions, or the support that comes with terms and conditions. I'll say this: there are cases where there's a requirement. For example, we've worked with musical organizations that will require you to place a musical component to the project that you want to undertake. I'm fine with that, mostly because we do musical stuff, and we've got a recording studio and a whole thing within K Media that does that. That's fine.
And I suppose that's still like a creative endeavor as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So you look at that and like, that works great. And then, of course, the other agendas that are more questionable, that have either social or some sort of thematic, requirement, where like, okay, now we're introducing some ideology into our work that we don't necessarily agree with. And the trick, or our approach to that, is we have to be very selective, right? And I'm going to say something a bit controversial. Someone out there is probably thinking, so you turn down money? And the answer is yes and no. No one in their right mind, as far as I'm concerned, should get into a situation where you're going to be arm twisted into becoming a mouthpiece for something you don't believe in, no matter how big the check is. And within the creative sector, what I'm going to say is very controversial, but I say this and it's based on research and actual research that we've conducted. And the honest truth is, money is not really the disadvantage or the deterrent that people in the creative sector make it out to be. Artists, in a nutshell, artists really don't just have a money problem, right? If you look at some of the success stories that have come out of our industry, for example, money did not play the leading role. It's not that someone was slapped with a gigantic check and then they became... No.
Okay.
The common trend is actually that the guys without money but have a body of work are the guys who excel. And that's mentioned very little. Let me give you a very apparent example.
Yeah, that's quite true.
Yeah, let me give you an apparent example in the form of Comexposed. We started out without the money. We put in the work for years, and then later on, people with resources approached us, and it was now them pitching themselves to us. You see, coming back to the point that I made earlier, that gives us the leeway to say, on what grounds are you offering this? And then we have that upper hand to say yes to that. Exactly, we've got that leverage. You see what I mean? And I wanna give you even smaller examples. I said that artists don't have a financial problem. And I'm not saying that money is a wash and everybody's got lots of money. Yes, Zimbabwe is a poor country, that's a fact. But that doesn't mean that's the inhibiting factor that stops people from actually doing work, right? I can name a number of guys who started out working from home, living with their parents on their gap year, but they applied themselves continuously and consistently. And now we look at them like they're overnight successes. And they do get funding. And we're like, oh, they're so lucky. No, they really put in the hard work.
Put in the work.
And there's also the one thing that most artists don't want to admit: they lack the financial literacy. So even if you give a lot of the money, which is something I've seen in research we've conducted, where we've been part of, grant giving and things like that. Even if you do give the money, you're not guaranteed success. The success rate on one of the projects we held where we were giving grants was kind of stifling, and it really just showed that money isn't the problem. There's a financial literacy problem, there's an organizational hierarchy problem, there's a professionalism problem. And if those are solved, if artists can be honest with themselves and say, yeah, we actually do need training there, and then we can manage finances, or we can then do whatever needs to be done subsequently, that's much better. But of course, that's controversial. A lot of people come to me and say, oh my gosh, you're speaking from a position of privilege, is what I've heard. I'm like, yeah, man. So it's something I'd love to see what people say in the comments section.
No, but to be fair, I think just the example I have seen is Pius, man. We were talking about this in his interview. Before they started Alula, that was maybe 10 years of work. It's like an absurd amount of work. Speaking to what you're talking about, a body of work, right? And
Pius was one of the first exhibitors presenters at Comexposed in 2015. I had known him a little before then, so he's come a very long way. He's a great example.
When people see him now and they think
it's an overnight.
It happened in a matter of 2-3 years.
I mean, a lot of people in the creative sector are starting to mistake support with handouts, right? Handouts and don't guarantee you success. It's easier for you to say, look guys, I've taken this project from concept to this functional, prototype like stage. Now I just need to cross the finish line, and the work that I've put in is worth X amount if we're to evaluate it financially. There's a lot more sympathy to that kind of approach, rather than
I haven't done anything, I've got an idea.
I'm just applying for those grants, man. It's different, So you're right, Pius is a great example of that kind of thing. And there are quite a few others, actually, I'm happy to say,
Yeah, that's fantastic, man. And then I think this one is one of those things that it hit me when I was at the last Comexposed. The one, was it late November? Yeah, I was there. I saw the books on the tables. I bought a couple. But being a curious guy, my question was scale. Like, why can't I find this in a shop? Why can't I find this in maybe a certain market for this that exists almost like on a daily basis, right? If I want, I go there. And so the making and distribution of comics, and whether this be online or in the physical space, it presents different challenges, but I think we can both agree that both mediums are like incredibly hard to achieve, right? What are some of the problems that creators are facing in that regard, in the making and the distribution of comics in Zim?
So making comics and making animation has never been easier, right?
It has never been easier.
It's never been easier. Let me explain what I mean. 15 years ago, you'd have needed to buy a lot of stationery, paints, supplies, and so on, and then you need the time, and then the skill too, right? Because you were working traditionally, you needed some kind of formal education, right? You're just not gonna draw and it's gonna work out fine. It's gonna cost you, right? And I'm saying now it's a lot easier because you can circumvent the education through YouTube and Google. That's number one. You can circumvent the cost of supplies and so on through digital technology, working on a computer. So it's much easier. Believe you me, I know. I was there in the rusty days. So that's number one, right? So making the comics is a matter of discipline, right? Of course, there will be need for support, insight, and so on. But I believe we've created structures through the Comexposed forums, and there are quite a few of them, where you can ask anyone anything. A number of those people have made comic book content of one type or another. So the support structure is there, right? The events that we do, the famous Comexposed open door policy. If you're working on something, if you feel you need the help, we're there for you, right? So in that regard, we can supplement the lack of skill, we can supplement the lack of supplies and all of that, and get you well on your way. Now, the difficult one that you mentioned, you're correct. The marketplace or the markets and how to distribute this this material. So the model that everyone is trying to emulate or hopes would suddenly exist is what you get in, developed countries, right? Where you have publishers such as Marvel or DC or just regular book publishers picking something up. That doesn't exist here because we don't have those publishers to begin with. And then, unfortunately for us, and because of the age of the internet and crowdfunding, and of course viral success stories, there's a misconception amongst artists that it's easy to achieve that kind of viral success, crowdfund something and then do it all by yourself. That is fundamentally wrong, right? It's wrong. However, there's that mentality and they swear by it. And I've watched for over a decade now as some artists have pursued that approach and they're hitting their heads against a wall thinking, why am I not popping off like artist so-and-so in Ireland or the Netherlands or the UK? Because they're completely different. We're in an economy where not anybody can go on your GoFundMe and give you $20.
The payment structures just don't exist.
They don't exist.
The infrastructure isn't there.
Exactly. You see? So there's that delusion, and it really is a problem, right? Because you have one artist, for example, who will create a great book. You bought some of them, and exhaust their resources and time in producing the book. Then they totally disregard the fact that the process of publishing and distributing and selling and marketing, those are professions all on their own. Therefore, you have a deficit of an entire team. Right? So Comexposed shows up and tries to supplement that, because what do we do for marketing? If we market our event, we can guarantee that 300 plus people will show up within a few hours and see your stuff. Good for you. That's great. That's our value proposition to you, right? And then at the same time, we're going to market it, so you're not going to have to post anything to say go to Comexposed. We're already doing that. So your marketing is old. And then as for distribution, you're going to bring your stock. Of course, it's not the be-all and end-all, but it should make you realize that as an artist, you're only the starting point. You're a cog in a wheel. The whole wheel is the industry. So the conversation that really needs to be taking place is, what can organizations like Comexposed or CCX Comics here in Zimbabwe or K-Media, for example, what can they do to fill that gap of publishing and distribution? You see? So when that happens, you have someone within such an organization who's dedicated to talking to a bookstore or a chain of bookstores, or someone who's dedicated to sorting out your socials in order to streamline and optimize them for sales and things like that. What's typically called business support services. But because a lot of artists don't know that there is work beyond the fun book stuff, they hit a dead end when they're done with the book, and before they know it, they're sitting on stock that's not moving, and then they call it a failure and they can't continue. So that is the major challenge, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the problem not being a money problem, because remember, to produce and print those, they are using some money. They just also gambling, because they're saying, I'm going to take on the whole risk, cross my fingers and hope for complete 100% sales, and perfect profit margins, and everything's going to be fine. That comes from an area.
Really is the case.
There's that financial literacy I was talking about. You see, it's no different from the music industry. You've got so many people releasing EPs and mixtapes, so many people making great music, even taking it to Spotify, but you're burnt out by the time you get it there. You actually neglect the fact that there's so much that needs to be done to get it into the hands of consumers. So that's one of the many problems that's plaguing the comic book and animation industry, but the content is there. And to be honest, if the right people had conversations with bookstore chains and so on, then you wouldn't be talking about distribution being a problem. The problem is the artist thinks that they have capacity to do everything from start to finish. That's just not real.
Yeah.